Hey everybody, how's it going? Andrew here. I just want to say real quick, if anyone is struggling to define their goals or don't have a plan in place with your game marketing, and because of that, it's making things challenging for you, then take a moment, go to my website, rengenmarketing.com, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my email list. Why? Because doing so will get you delivered right to your inbox a free marketing plan template specifically designed for games. Look, I've already verified recently that 2 college professors have used this in their courses and shared it with their students because they understand the value and how helpful it is for them to plan out what their marketing looks like. What's really awesome is simply the fact that these professors are incorporating marketing and this level of marketing into their courses because, again, they understand the value that marketing plays. So it's really exciting to hear this. But on top of that, lots of other people have utilized this template, have found it really helpful for them to further define their goals and provide them clarity and direction in what they need to do to make things happen with their awareness efforts. So again, if any of this sounds like it could be helpful for you, then please just check out the website, rengenmarketing.com, scroll down, sign up for that email newsletter, and then right to your inbox, you will get that free marketing plan template. So again, can't thank you enough for being such great listeners. And now let's get right to the show. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about supercharging the development process. Now, if there is one thing a developer and teams strive for, it's to maintain quality while consistently hitting milestones. But sometimes it's a struggle finding that sweet spot where quality and efficiency align. So in today's episode, we're digging into the intricacies of optimizing production, from uncovering expert strategies for efficient solutions to streamlining the development process, so you're better equipped to achieve that fine balance between speed and quality, supercharging your game development process. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Seth Koster. Seth, how's it going?
Great. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Excited to have you here because we're going to be talking about some really interesting things that I don't think we've really explored on the podcast, at least to this depth and level. So happy to have you here. It's going to be a good time. I know, because you are excited to share this stuff too.
Of course.
Absolutely. All right. But before we get into that, folks, we got to give proper introduction to Seth here. He is the game programmer and designer and co-founder at Butterscotch Shenanigans. And you guys are approaching like 12 years now?
Yep. Yeah, we were founded in June of 2012.
Wow. Impressive. And I mean, just to maybe familiarize yourself, if you're not familiar with them, I mean, they've had some projects in the past, Crashlands and Crashlands 2, Levelhead, Quadrupus.
Quadrupus. Like an octopus.
That's
but,
right.
With four tentacles.
I do remember the key art now, as you just mentioned that. Quadrupus Rampage. And I mean, just some other like recognitions and awards. I mean, they've received, like in particular, Crashlands, the mobile game, got Mobile Game of the Year for 2016 from numerous publications. So that I would say that's the most notable. But you guys have been like acquiring and getting lots of other various awards as well with the work that you've been doing with your projects. And another cool thing that I would like to actually have you share a little bit about is you're also the co-host, one of the co-hosts of Coffee with Butterscotch podcast. So please share a little bit about that podcast and also who's on the podcast with you.
Yeah. So the studio was founded by myself and my two brothers back in 2012. So it's a family business. It was the three of us for quite some time. And after Crashlands came out, we started hiring and growing the studio. And so nowadays we're around like 9 full-time people and then a bunch of some part-time QA contractors, stuff like that. But we started the podcast while we were developing Crashlands. A big part of that was kind of related to the impetus for us starting to work on Crashlands in the first place, which is that our youngest brother, Sam, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at that time. And it really, we were working on some smaller mobile games and stuff, and we were kind of looking at what we were doing, and we were like, we don't know if this is going to be the last game we ever get to make together. And if it is, then let's go big. Let's just make the biggest, coolest thing we can make. And Sam had a vision for that. And so Crashlands kind of became his dream game that we kind of came together to make with him while he was going through chemotherapy and all that. And we started the podcast as a way to kind of connect more with our players, to kind of share the journey that we were going through at that time, both like as creators, but also as a family and as business people trying to, start this business. Like there were so many things happening at that time. And we were just like, it would be a shame if all this that's going on just got lost to time and we didn't have a record of what we were thinking about at the time and the struggles we were having. And so we started the podcast in 2015, and we just use it to talk about, as we say on the podcast, we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. So it's kind of an amalgamation of all that stuff. Sometimes we'll do a deep dive about some really esoteric thing like, how do you do localization in a game? Sometimes we just take listener questions, but we always try to, keep a positive spin on things and be very goofy and jovial as well while trying to be insightful. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun doing that.
Awesome. And not only that, I mean, like I love the initial reason, intent, and purpose. Like, I mean, in the story that's attached to that, right? It's like, there's so many great things that I think that came out of something that could have been something that is not so great. But I mean, but even still, I mean, how you positioned it and the whole reason for doing it was all in a positive reason. And I don't know, I think it's very insightful and enlightening. So thank you for sharing kind of the origin or the reason behind it, but then also like how that ended up aligning with everything you do, your players, your business, and even in the family side. Is pretty cool that you guys ended up doing that. So thank you.
Yeah. And we've kept it going. We're in episode 450 something. It's every week we get one out. So it's been fun.
Awesome. And we'll do a call out to this again in the end, folks, but where can you listen to this podcast?
Oh, it's all over the place. So just wherever you get podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, Apple stuff, just whatever.
Awesome.
We just cast a wide net, So.
Love it. So yeah, Coffee with Butterscotch, folks, is a podcast. And I mean, Seth, come on, when you're not making all these awesome games, when you're not busy with work, when you're not having fun times on the podcast with your bros, what are you doing in your spare time, hobbies, or any other like maybe recognitions that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah. So I mean, ever since COVID, my hobbies have kind of shrunk down quite a bit. I used to do a lot more kind of like events out in the game dev community here in St. Louis, where I'm at. But I also, I like to work out. I'm a big weightlifting guy, and I play World of Warcraft as kind of my main hobby game. But I also try to play lots of other games and stuff like that. As far as like just general hobbies, it feels weird because making games was my hobby and then it became my job, and I still do that for fun sometimes via game jams and things like that. Yeah, and also I have a couple of dogs, so I like to spend time with my dogs and just kind of vibing. So
sweet. And one thing I know we were talking about, prior to recording, which I thought was pretty interesting too, is like
what is your background in? Because I always, when I know these things about guests, I always like to kind of like showcase a little bit just to give another perspective of, sometimes people have a hard time thinking that what they're doing in the industry, that they don't have really a place because of your background, but we're going to show them real quick that that's somewhat irrelevant or even beneficial.
Yeah, I'd say it is. I'd say coming into games from an indirect path is probably the best way to do it, because games are not a thing. Games are a pile of diverse disciplines, whether it's storytelling, cinematography, music, programming, physics, growth models, like whatever you can think of. Games, you need to know about it to make a good game. And the more you know about the more things, the more material you have to pull from. One of my favorite, before I talk about my background, one of my favorite stories about that is back when we were working on the first Crashlands, we ended up solving a weird design problem by stumbling across a research paper on the foraging behaviors of spider monkeys.
That's awesome.
And it turned out that also looped back into human psychology, because, hey, we're monkeys. We're basically smooth, wet monkeys, right? Like I said, we sweat. We're sweaty, smooth monkeys. And so the psychology kind of carries over. And we brought the results of that research paper into one of our designs for world layout in Crashlands. And it worked. Like, it felt great all of a sudden. And so, just being able to pull from lots of different disciplines just makes you a better designer. So my own background was in finance and economics. I was originally going to study film in college, but I could not get into the film program. I was at USC, and it's a very selective film school, and they just would not let me in. I did switch from that to computer science, which I failed, by the way. I failed out of comp sci. It turns out not that I'm a bad programmer, because that's my whole job now. It's just the way that was taught and being delivered just did not somehow jive with the way that I learn. And I bailed on that and switched over to finance and economics, which taught me a lot about business, but also taught me a lot about statistics, developing mathematical models to simplify and represent interactions of things in the world, whether it's stock prices and kind of analyzing different expense reports and then making projections or making growth projections or whatever. But finance and economics is all about taking huge data sets of numbers and then boiling it down to something that you can make sense of, which turns out to be a really useful skill for designing and developing games. And then the business side of that helped a lot in just getting the studio off the ground and figuring out how to, create a sustainable company as well. And after my undergrad, I went into an MBA and JD, so a joint law and business program. But at that time, I also started picking up programming on my own. So it took me quite a few years to get over the sting of failing out of comp sci. And once I kind of got my wits back together and was like, I can do this. I started self-teaching programming while I was in law school and started making my own small games, started doing some game jams and stuff like that. And I ended up actually publishing some stuff and starting to see like, oh, wait, like you don't have to wait for anybody's permission to be a game developer. You can just make games and publish them, and that's it. You're a game developer now. And so I quit out of those two programs, out of the law and business program, and just went right into making games full time at that point. So yeah, kind of a circuitous path, but yeah. And I didn't even start learning to program until I was 23.
Yeah.
So like, it's never too late. Even if you started at 43, you can become a great programmer. It doesn't matter, right?
I love it. And to your point, I mean, man, there's so many things that you could take probably from your past experiences. In fact, I know we have one episode specifically about a guest and their past experiences and how they leverage it, but there's just so many other different ways that can be done. And you're another testament to that as well. So awesome. And thank you. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because it's like, you never know. And don't put yourself down because it might not align in some cases, and especially yours, it all aligned. It all came back. And look, the thing you failed at, you're doing proficiently now.
Yeah. And it always, it makes me sad because I've been through it as well. But to hear people say things like, oh, I just suck at math, and things like that. Or even I hate math. I hate physics. I hate chemistry, whatever it is people say. And like, the problem I have with that is people have generalized a fixed aspect about themselves based on a really specific experience they had, right? So like if you took a chemistry class in high school and had a really bad time, then for the rest of your life, you just say, I hate chemistry, which is wild because chemistry may have nothing to do with that bad experience you had in that class. It's just your teacher wasn't great, or it wasn't taught well for how you learn, or maybe you just weren't ready for it at that time, And it's sad because people, and like I did this with programming until I finally got over it after 4 years. People close doors on themselves. They just decide that they can't do it, and they stop learning in that domain. And I think that's always to your detriment, right?
Yeah.
So
I think it's funny that you share this because I am reading a book right now, and there's from what I understand, there is a term, I forget what it is, for what you just described, but it was talking about that exact thing. And I'm just like, dude, this is kind of weird that you're talking about this thing I just literally read, I think, last night. So, but it's true.
Hold on, we just had a Discord freeze up there.
Nope, we're good.
I lost that whole chunk of what you were saying.
I see. So
yeah.
We recorded everything fine on my end, folks. But just to give Seth some more context, basically what I said was what you just shared is something I literally just read in a book last night.
Wow, nice.
So anyways.
Sometimes things come together like that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, thank you for sharing all that stuff. Really, like, just amazing stuff already. And we haven't even gotten to the conversation yet, folks. But before we do, we need to put Seth through the Q box round. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's just a few random questions I prepared for Seth today. So Seth, are you ready for the Q box round? Name one thing that motivates you every day.
So I'm gonna name two because there's a positive and a negative. Depending on how you want to think about it. For me, the positive is that I get to work with great people every day, and the stuff that we do together has the potential to reach millions of people and bring happiness and joy into the world, right? Which is super cool, and not that many people get that opportunity. And I think it's important to appreciate, that's a thing that I get to do. On the negative side, if I don't do that stuff, then the whole studio collapses and I lose my job and my money and my livelihood and everything. So motivation isn't really a thing that I even think about. I got to do it. This is my job. I've got to always be moving forward. Some days I may not feel like it, but I can always find something that I can move forward on. So
nice. I was thinking of Dory from Finding Nemo saying, just keep swimming.
Yeah. I think if you're, I do get that question a lot, especially from hobbyists who are like, how do I stay motivated to work on my project? And I was thinking about that structurally, which is, it's nearly impossible to be motivated if the consequences of failure don't matter.
Yep.
If you make your game and you launch it and you haven't tied any personal stakes to it, then yeah, you have to summon willpower to make it happen. But if you know that if it doesn't work out well, then you're gonna have a real problem. Then you're gonna figure out how to make it work. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Second one. What advice would you give to someone else that's just starting out?
Kind of in line with what I was saying about motivation. You've got to make stuff and publish it. Even if the stuff that you're making isn't up to your own personal standards, it's very easy to just strive for perfection and just keep working on the same thing for decades. I like the saying, no game is ever finished. You just stop working on it. When we launched Crashlands, we had at least 300 line items on our workboard of things that needed to go into the game before launch. But we also only had $500 left in the bank. And it didn't really matter how many things were on that list. We had to get the game out, right? And so you can never finish a game. Just get it out and get the feedback from people, and then use that to motivate your next thing. But get out of your own way and just pump stuff out.
Awesome. And last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
So my go-to game for almost 20 years is World of Warcraft. Off and on, I kind of play it in waves. So that still playing that, and I've also been putting a lot of time into Baldur's Gate 3 because most people who have been following games lately. So I am looking to play Helldivers. I had a free weekend, or I had an open weekend to play it when it first launched, but that was when they're having all their server problems. So I haven't found the time to get back into it yet, but I'm pretty pumped about that too.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that stuff, and so we can get to know you a little bit more. But now that we've gone through the Q Box round, let's get into our discussion, because it's a good one. And specifically, and what I shared with you folks during the intro of this episode, we're going to be talking about supercharging the development process. So to kick it off, in the realm of indie game development, why is it essential to have efficient production processes?
Great question. There's an easy answer, which is cost, right? Like, the more efficient something is, the cheaper it is to get it made. But I think that's too reductive. I like to think about things in terms of cycle times, which is, there's a point in time where you have an idea of something that you think would be cool or important to have in your game. And then there's another point in time, which is where that thing is now in the game in a way that you can interact with it and evaluate whether it's working, and iterate on it, right? So that's the cycle time. And if your cycle times are long, so let's say it takes you 2 months to go from having an idea to being able to look at that thing in the game and play with it. That's such a long cycle time that you basically can't iterate, right? And especially if once you've got the thing in the game, once you interact with it, if you need to make changes to it, if the cycle times on those changes are also very long, the feedback loops get way too long and you can't refine things. I'm a big believer that games are an experiential medium where you can have a beautiful game design document with all kinds of concept art and really cool ideas. And then if you execute that game exactly as it was originally laid out in the game design document, it will probably not be fun. Not because the ideas are bad, but because you need lots of time to iterate on the balance of it and the execution. And sometimes you also run into technical hurdles or new ideas, because as you play with one part of the game, you realize there's something really interesting there that you hadn't foreseen. And if you don't pursue that, you're leaving something really cool on the table, right? So in my mind, iteration is the real meat of game development. And the better your production processes are, the faster your cycle times are, and you can get feedback on the stuff that you are doing. And also with that, you don't need a giant game design document. You just need a starting point. You need like a general vision of what should it be like to play this game, and what are kind of like the couple of pillars that we want to build this game around from a design perspective. And then you can just start making the thing and evaluating whether or not it's hitting that vision and quickly iterate. And that's what allows you to just have a really fun, playable game right out of the gate that only gets better, as opposed to one that, takes forever to build, then it sucks, and then it takes forever to, struggle to get it to a point where it doesn't suck anymore. And some games never get there. I think, I generally don't, like throw shade at other studios, but every now and then a game comes out where you're like, what happened here? And I think something like the conversation around Starfield is a great example of that, where the way that the game was talked about in advance was this huge scope, kind of like systems rich, deep experience where you can kind of go out in space and kind of do anything. And what actually came out the other side after so many years of development was that, like, it had all those systems in it, and it was giant. It has thousands of planets, but the planets are kind of empty, and the systems aren't that compelling, and everything you do is kind of bland. And the player feedback reflected that. And if you learn about the development processes that they had while working on this game, it's a very diffuse responsibility kind of environment. It's very hard for any one person to say, I've got a vision for a really great thing, I'm going to put that into the game. You just can't do that, especially on a team that size. And so that's why we try to optimize our processes, is so that we can quickly get feedback about what's going on in the game and quickly make changes to those things.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that's a great example of calling out, and because it's happened in other cases too, where essentially whether it's, because I mean, anybody can place blame, right? Oh, is marketing for communicating it that way. But like, if everybody's on the same page in terms of what that vision is, then it was clear. It was communicated correctly. But if you don't look at things holistically from the process, all the way down to what the player experience is like, and that doesn't align, like you said, with everything from the cycles and getting that feedback, be able to help ensure that what you're making aligns all the way to the end, the very end experience, the user experience.
Yeah. And so for Crash Lands 2, we really took this lesson to heart when we had a reckoning where we were working on the game for a year using our normal production processes, which usually, at the time, amounted to me being the game programmer. And as the game programmer, I was responsible for implementation. So if Sam, as the artist, produced an art asset, he could upload the asset into the project, but getting that asset connected to something in the world and getting the animations hooked up and all of that was something that I would do as the programmer, which also meant that our team wasn't scalable, because if we added another artist, well, I can't implement twice the art while also maintaining the rest of the code. So I was the bottleneck there. And we kind of realized that, after about a year, we looked at where we were at with the game and the overall vision for the game, and we were just like, we can't do this. Like, we cannot deliver on the vision of this game with the processes that we're using. And so we hit pause on development and took 6 months to build a tool called the Game Changer, which is a tool that lives inside the game, doesn't require code, and allows members of the dev team to, from within the game itself, add content to the game and change things about the game. And so, for example, like just yesterday, we're working on fleshing out some new biomes and zones and stuff. And Sam said, hey, we're going to need a bunch of loot drops from all these different new resources we have. Can we get those framed out? And I was like, sure. I mean, he could have done it because it's in the Game Changer, but I had some slack. And so I fired up the Game Changer, and within about an hour and a half, I had about 28 new items added to the game that were actually dropping from resources, and they all had different, descriptions and properties and stuff like that, because the Game Changer allows for that, And so taking that 6 months to do zero game development and just tools development has paid off 10x since then, right? And that's the kind of thing that we realized, because like at the time, our cycle times were incredibly long. It was really hard to get stuff into the game, and we had to do something. And so that's what we did, and it's worked out great.
That's really awesome, because I know one area that a lot of people face that are probably common challenges are what you just outlined. Like, hey, there's this bottleneck, and this bottleneck now increases these cycles, like everything that you were just sharing before. And I think it's really important to call out on the Game Changer, which apparently is a game changer. Sorry for me making like a really cheesy.
That's why we called it that. I mean, we're all about cheesy puns. But
like seriously though, I mean, and like think about it too, because you said like, hey, look, yeah, it took us time, energy, resources to put together this tool, but what was the trade-off? I mean, like that was your return on investment worth it? Yes, like profound, right?
Yeah, well, and the wild thing was after 6 months of dev on the Game Changer, once it was even just in an MVP state. So that was about, that was a couple of years ago. We started to work on the Game Changer. So it's become dramatically more capable since then. But we had a big stack of changes and things we needed to do in the game as a response to a play test that we did. And we were staring down the barrel of that stack. And I was like, that's going to take a couple of months to do all those things. And that was part of why we, hit pause and started working on the Game Changer. Well, once the Game Changer was up and running, we revisited that stack of changes, and it took a week.
Damn.
And so it's like, so it's like almost immediately we're just moving at 10x speed, So, and it's only gotten faster since then. And it's allowed us to scale up the team. So we're able to add more artists. We brought in a writer and narrative designer who's developing the quests. And these people can do this with very little technical requirements because they can use this tool that doesn't require them to code stuff up and stuff like that.
I love that you say that too, because especially now in a very different realm, but I'm trying to paint a broad stroke here. We see some, let's say, efficiencies where people are looking to scale, they build up. It's really funny. The last guest I just interviewed, I just had a very similar conversation around this specifically, but they look to scale, and the next thing you know, we need to now recede, too much, layoffs. We're all too familiar with this, right? But then, and in addition to that too, there's the other side of, we're looking at these things where everybody's like, my whole dev cycle needs to be reduced because, so many times I've been trying to, people have been making these games, taking 10 years, and then for what? That they can't recoup their costs because missed opportunity costs and all these other things. But then now we're talking about things of, really just looking at things differently, investing the time to the point where, and like you said, we're able to scale. And sorry, I was digressing a bit, but my point getting back here about the scaling aspect is by creating this tool, by creating this efficiency, you can now scale within reason and within means instead of, I got money, let's scale to make things bigger. Because if your processes aren't fine-tuned, then it doesn't matter how big you're going to scale because at some point, something's going to give.
Yeah, and I think we made the same mistake right after Crashlands launched. Our processes were not good. We were crunching. We were working 70 hours a week easily. And when I say easily, I mean often. It was hard. We were constantly getting smashed by bug reports. We were just generally overwhelmed, and we scaled up and added a bunch of people to the team as soon as Crashlands came out, and some money started coming in. We scaled up because we had so many problems. And I think that's a really common mistake that people make is thinking that scaling is a solution to a problem. Scaling is an amplifier of your problems. Like if you have more people and you have a bunch of problems, you just have even more problems that are even bigger. You should scale because things are easy, if that makes sense. Like if you spent the time to work on your processes to the point where it's easy to add art to the game, then you can add another artist. If you're having a hard time getting your art into the game because your pipelines are weird or you have high error rates or you have a bottleneck like me as the game programmer implementing stuff, you cannot scale the art team. You're only going to just make a bunch more problems for yourself. And similarly, it's still the case that I'm still the sole game programmer, but the way that I approach my work now is about 3/4 of my time goes into programming tools and game systems, so that the rest of the team, which we have is called the content development team, the rest of the team can very easily iterate and get their ideas into the game without me having to specifically interact with them on that issue, right? So if an artist can add a whole new animated creature to the game that has all the mechanics and all the interactions and the AI and everything without ever having to touch a line of code, then that saves me so much time as the game programmer, right? So if that's where I put my programming time instead of manually adding that creature myself, then we have scalability, right? So only scale when something is easy, not because it's hard.
Yeah.
If that tracks.
No, I'm understanding it. It makes complete sense. And in a completely different direction too. This does, well, what we're talking about is, processes and specifically development, but let's apply this from a different lens, which you'll totally be able to do. Let's look at it from a business management perspective, from, a finance perspective. If what's happening to your bottom line, if you're scaling and you don't have the processes and stuff, like when we're talking about margins and things like that, your net, income and all those things from a business perspective, is that number growing or shrinking if you're scaling without proper efficiencies or processes in place?
Yeah. In general, scaling is an initial net negative. You need to train people up. You need to spend a bunch of time finding people, especially when you're a small team. At the time we were only 3, which meant that every minute that we spent interviewing candidates, looking for people, writing up employment contracts, those were minutes that were not going into game production because we were the same team as the game production team, right? So at a small scale, you got these mutually exclusive problems of you can only do one thing at a time. And then if you bring people in and you have to train them, well, who's training them? Well, the game production team. So again, you're not making games. So you have this long period of time where you're not creating new products, and you're not creating value for your customers. And what you need to kind of ask yourself is, what would it look like for it to be easy to add somebody to this team? And do we have that? If you don't have that, then that should be your priority, because that has a weird knock-on consequence, which is everything becomes incredibly easy for yourself too. If your processes are very streamlined and understandable and robust, then that helps you develop the games, right? As well as plug somebody else into that process in a very intuitive way that doesn't require 6 months of training or whatever. Somebody can be up and running. And so we recently added an artist to the team, and she was up and running in 2 days. She was adding content to the game in 2 days, and we had some kind of guardrails on to try to make sure, just in case something went horribly wrong. But within about a week, she was demonstrating that she had mastery over all the processes to get her stuff into the game. And we took those training wheels off, metaphorically, and she's able to we can just hand her a bunch of, like, a list of things we need, and it's in the game very quickly, So that's the way to approach that.
I absolutely love that. And, I want to call to one thing you mentioned too, because you're saying how, like, we're spending this time, energy, effort on, like, helping writing contracts and doing this. And here's the thing I think a lot of people struggle with too. And you give me your thoughts on this too. There's going to be, especially if you're starting out small, there's going to be so many different areas that are important. There's, like, when you say priority and importance, they all have that priority tag, right? In essence. But here's the reality of it. I would say this is very arbitrary number I'm throwing out at you folks. But I mean, let's simplify it. 80-20 rule. 20% of what you do is going to create 80% of the results. But realistically, and sometimes it could be like 10%. It could be as low as 5% is going to be what I would like to call impact work. That's really going to move the needle to results and stuff. But guess what? That doesn't mean the remaining percentage isn't important either. But from what you just outlined with that great example is like, hey, look, all this stuff's important, but the real stuff that's important is this. But by implementing these processes and everything else, how does that then scale within means and everything? And then, everything just aligns. So, but I don't know.
Yeah. And I think we kind of stumbled into something really good on accident with regard to process improvements and this kind of scalability, which is a lot of times smaller teams are set up such that every person on the team is developing the game directly, right? So you might have like 2 programmers and 2 artists, and like maybe that's your starting team. And every person is just working on the game. That's what they're there to do. And then other business stuff will kind of happen, ad hoc. Maybe one person handles the books and one person talks to lawyers and one person talks to platforms for distribution or something. But by and large, everybody on the team is a core part of advancing the game forward. What we ended up doing was, when we first started the studio, it was me as the game programmer and Sam as the artist. So just like I said, everybody in the studio is just making the games. After we had launched a couple of games was when our third brother, Adam, joined the team. And he had just gotten his PhD in cellular molecular biology and had spent a lot of time developing programs and scripts in his lab for OCR image analysis on bacteria samples. And so he had a background in some very strange kind of data analysis and just lots of very hyper specific kinds of programming, problem solving types of skills. And he came in and saw that, Sam and I already had a dynamic of who was responsible for what. And he came in and he was like, what do you need from me? How do I fit into this? And so originally we were like, oh, well, we'll just add him to the games programming team. But as he was working with me on the game programming, he couldn't help but zoom out and see other problems that we were having as a studio. And he then decoupled from the dev team and became the tools developer. So his whole thing was try to identify problems with our processes and develop solutions to those problems. So right at the outset, a third of our team was somebody not working on the games, but still a programmer who's developing tools. So you're talking about the 80-20 rule, right? In our case, it's this, 33-66 rule. A third of your team is there to empower the other 2/3 of the team. If everybody's just making stuff, then nobody has the time to zoom out and make their own work better. It's just, because you have to pause development to develop those tools if the people making the tools are the people developing the games. So that's something that we kind of stumbled into, and we've maintained that since then, where it's still the case that our core development team is a minority of the members of the studio, and everybody else is there developing tools and processes and systems to make it very easy for that team to exist, if that makes sense.
See, I love hearing this because a lot of the times I feel like, again, I might not be following it as much or whatever, but my understanding is a lot of mainstream processes don't necessarily outline a process quite like this. And it's not to say it hasn't been done before or people haven't talked about it, but I think at a mainstream level or broader level, these aren't the types of conversations that really happen, but it kind of it makes a lot of sense where it's like, what is being done to further support the rest of the core development, the rest of the core team and everything, as opposed to working all together within that. I mean, it's one system, it can work, but how are there other ways to make it more efficient? And I think you just outlined a really cool and creative way of doing it. And because who I don't know, and again, this could just be my bubble that I'm in, but I don't hear of too many jobs that maybe they're different titles, but talk about tool creator, right?
Yeah, I mean, it has different buzzwords. People call nowadays people would probably call that a DevOps engineer or something, which again kind of misses the point of DevOps, which DevOps is a philosophy that the entire company is supposed to be using. If you are in a company, you should be doing DevOps stuff. And there might be a person who is a programmer who helps enable some of the things that you need in order to execute on DevOps principles. But the idea of there being a DevOps engineer has always been very strange for us because it's a holistic thing that we should all be doing. So, but yeah, tools developer, whatever you want to call it. But also kind of to your point about how that doesn't seem that common. One of the things that we started doing when we started switching into learning about DevOps, which is this kind of philosophy, is we decided that time is a constraint, not a flexible resource. Starting in about 2018, when we started really learning about this stuff, we just we just drew a line in the sand and we just said, we are not crunching anymore. We will be working 35 hours a week. Not even 40, because hey, you got your lunch break in there, right? So 35 good hours a week of getting shit done. And that's our constraint. And if we find ourselves crunching to hit a deadline, then the deadline is wrong or the project is wrong. And we need to change one of those two things, because that's not acceptable. It's not sustainable to burn ourselves out, get mentally drained, add tons of bugs to the code base, probably create more problems than we solve, and be miserable doing it. It's not worth it. Life's too short for that, So we've made some big changes in that direction.
Yeah. And I really love this too, because everything you just shared up to this point too is folks, let's face it, these are all like typical production processes that we've outlined, that you've probably seen yourself, and through your own efforts, through even some of your mistakes and just accidents, you discovered ways to highlight some of these areas, like, okay, why am I the bottleneck? What keeps happening? Or why is this occurring? And ultimately it just highlights, where you can find ways to really efficiently maximize your production and everything else that goes along with it. So yeah, it's just so enlightening stuff. Well, I want to dive into a little bit here too about I don't know, we covered quite a bit of this too to a degree, but what are basically discussing some other strategies to further streamline production. You mentioned tools is a big part, but are there any other type of let's say methodologies that you use yourself that you would even potentially recommend to other people?
Yeah, the biggest thing for us was, like I mentioned earlier, learning about DevOps and incorporating those principles into everything that we do. So DevOps it's a philosophy of essentially integrating all the different parts of your workflows and using principles that come from manufacturing to evaluate what you're doing. So a great example is just the idea of work should only flow in one direction, meaning there's a pipeline. So if you take art as an example, there's an ideation step, then there's potentially a concepting step, depending on whether you do that or not. Then the artists create an asset, and then there's an integration step where it needs to be brought into the project. And then there's an iteration and testing and sort of evaluation step, right? So as an example, back when we were first learning about this stuff, we started keeping tabs on our error rate for art assets, as in when an art asset got created and sent over to me as the person to implement it, how frequently did I have to send it back and say, actually, we can't use this because there's some problem with it. Maybe it's got a technical issue, or there's a sub image missing, or whatever. There's lots of different things that could potentially go wrong. And our error rate was 40%. So if you think about this as a factory, treadmill or a conveyor belt, if 40% of the time when something was working its way down the conveyor belt, you've got to take it off the line and send it back and redo it and then send it down the conveyor belt again, you'd be like, what the hell's going on in this factory? So that's one of those principles where, work should only be flowing in one direction. And if it gets sent back, then that's a moment where you need to analyze why. Why did that thing go wrong? And how do we make sure that going forward, that same kind of an error doesn't happen again, right? And so people will sometimes call this philosophy shifting left, as in don't solve problems once they're already way down the pipeline. Shift your solutions to those problems as close to the source as you can so that they stop being created in the first place. And again, that comes from manufacturing, which then got sort of repurposed as DevOps, which is more taking those principles in a software development approach. So if you want to learn about DevOps stuff, I'd recommend there's a book called The Phoenix Project, which is a fiction novel that introduces the concepts of DevOps. It's actually a really good read. It's a legit page turner. I call it a business thriller. And then there's an accompanying book called the DevOps Handbook that goes into lots of detail about the the ideas introduced in that novel. So yeah, I could talk about that all day, but I mean, that core idea of solving the reasons why problems were created in the first place, not solving the problems once they're created. And the more you do that, the tighter your feedback loops get and your processes get better and better. Another big one from DevOps is the principle of making work visible, which again, if every time an error happens, you just fix it and move on, and you don't document that anywhere and keep track of it, that you may, like, apparently we had this 40% error rate on our art exports for years and years, thousands of assets. Each time one goes wrong, we just send it back and move on. And if you can't easily see that's happening in some kind of a documentation somewhere, then you just don't even know that you have a problem. You got too many other things you're worrying about, right? And taking that time to periodically zoom out and develop ways of keeping track of what's going on in your pipelines, in your studio, that is what really allows you to start genuinely solving the problems that you have, because you can finally see them.
What I love about this explanation here is I think indirectly, and again, tell me if I'm wrong with this or anything. It's like you're identifying not just like a systems approach to solving these problems, but in a way, it's almost like you're gamifying it too. And I'm looking, and I'm also looking at for the perspective. Think of how many warehouse factory management games out there that do so well that I think in line a lot of developers seem to like as well too. But it's no different than that in a sense. And if you have that connection and understanding of how those things work and apply it to your actual development process, you can start making things more fun. And another thing I'll call it too is, because I think this goes more on an emotional level, which can get tricky sometimes depending on everything from how your team culture is and everything. But like when you're calling out from things like, oh, we noticed 40% errors, I think it's important to make note of, and again, this is probably things that come down to company values and other things too. It's not to say that, oh, we're going back to Sam now and be like, dude, 40% of the time, or in any way, shape, or form, making him or anyone feel that, oh, I'm the problem, because it's not the case, right?
Yeah, that's something that we've worked really hard to cultivate, the idea that nearly every problem is a structural problem. So in the case of the art, it's never, why is Sam so bad at making consistent art? It's okay, we have this error rate. Let's sit down and look at our process together for how not just how he is making the art, but how is he deciding how to make the art? What's going into those decisions? What information does he have? But the assumption is that he's not making errors on purpose, right?
Yep.
And what's the difference between the times he makes an error and the time that he doesn't? Is there some crucial piece of information that either he needs but doesn't realize he needs to ask for, or that he needs but we didn't realize he needed and nobody gave it to him? Just like, what's the entire process start to finish? And like you said, sort of anonymize it in the sense that talk about the process, talk about the structures you have, not the person doing it. Because if somebody, I say, like, we're surrounded by smart people in our studio who care. If those people are making errors, it's not because they don't care, and it's not because they're idiots. It's because there's something in the way that's making it hard for them to do their job the way that we want it done, right? And so fix that thing and get that person involved in the conversation of what they need to get it fixed as well.
Yeah, and I want to call it too, because this thought just occurred to me as you were sharing that. Like, I know here on the show in the past, some episodes, we talk about how important communication with your team is. But I think what you just highlighted here, and it's important to understand and view from this perspective too, is process your processes are also a form of communication. Because just because if you're talking with someone about X, Y, or Z doesn't necessarily change how you may feel or change your understanding compared to their understanding. But if a process is documented and clear, same thing when you talk about legal stuff, right? Like the reason why you have contracts to begin with is so it's written, it's clear, you have this single source that you can go back to and say, was this done or not, right? Same exact thing. Because now it's looking at things more objectively, it's taking out any potential emotion within reason, and where you're just, but again, to my point, process is also a form of communication. You can't just rely on communication from a verbal standpoint or even textual in some case, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you got to recognize that there's a reason we have the phrase human error. Nobody is error free. No human being. And now that we have all these, all these LLMs, all these AIs, hey, they hallucinate stuff all the time too. As a programmer, I've written probably more bugs than I could count. Not on purpose, right? It's just something that happens. And the approach that we try to take then instead of saying, how do we find people who don't make errors? That's impossible. Instead, it's how do we change our processes so that it's nearly impossible to make an error, right? Whatever that might entail, but recognizing that errors will happen, and you need something that's going to catch that error before the output of that person. It's then sent downstream to the next person who then gets exposed to the error, right?
Yep.
So I will write bugs sometimes, but also I have my own testing step to catch them myself, and then we have a QA team to catch them before they go to players, right? So you're going to make errors. You want processes that don't ship those errors downstream to the next person, right? That's the goal.
Yeah, and you know what? Think of it from like a growth perspective. Think of it in terms of a talent acquisition perspective. Like if you have these processes so clearly defined, like maybe then if you're looking for talent, if you're looking to scale, you may not necessarily need to rely on talent that is extremely experienced or extremely skillful. You can still rely on talent that gives them an opportunity to grow and learn, but also at a cost that's going to be potentially reduced because of where they are. I mean, folks, I'm flabbergasted. Not that it's anything new, but just everything that's just outlined here. And if you look at, and then it's not to say that Seth doesn't, because I'm sure he definitely does, but I'm for hearing this, looking at from what's the bottom line? What does this all mean? I have more time. I have more money. I move the needle with stuff that actually needs to be done, like development. Because again, my problem in my work is you need to do marketing. And other people sometimes are like, well, we need a development. And we're both right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But
you need everything.
Yeah. But still, it's like everything that we talked about that Seth has shared with us today is really just outlining these key points and why it's so important. Yeah, it takes an extra time to build these tools. Yeah, we dedicated starting out a whole third of our team to do so. But man, I mean, everything that he's saying, like I said, it's saving time, it's saving money, it's scaling within reason, not going nuts. It's doing, I would say, everything right within a proper understanding of what right is. But
yeah, I like to think about it too in terms of speed limits. So back when we were making Crashlands, we did not have a QA team. We did not know about DevOps. We had pretty awkward pipelines, lots of bottlenecks. It was a very small team, and we were kind of first learning about everything. And when we launched the game, first of all, we had to crunch for 8 weeks prior to the launch because we did a beta test right, a couple months before the launch. And our testers are I think we had 20 testers. They found 2,200 bugs. Okay. And the game was playable, and so many of the bugs were edge cases, but there were so many of them that we had to triage and pick, the 500 most pressing ones and get those resolved before the launch. And then it was another 6 weeks of crunch post-launch trying to fix up the rest of those bugs. Later, we wanted to launch the game on some other platforms. We wanted to try to figure out how to, can we get it onto Xbox? Can we get it onto the Nintendo Switch, which was coming out like around that time. Well, we didn't have controller support. We only developed the game with one form factor in mind. And suddenly we had to take 3 months to redo all the interfaces to allow for controller support. Then we wanted to bring the game to China. Well, we didn't set up the game to be able to have its text translated. And so that took 8 months to update the game so that we could change all the text and interfaces and learn about the whole process. And so, in retrospect, we like to look at original Crash Ends and say, well, it took 2 years and 3 months to develop from start development to launch date. But we actually had to work on the game for another 2 years, essentially, because we cut so many corners that the game actually was not in that serviceable of a state where it was fine, relatively bug-free, playable on lots of platforms, lots of accessibility options, different control schemes, stuff like that. So really, we just launched the game halfway through the development process is what really happened. Right? And so you can cut those corners and try to tell yourself that all this testing and considering all these different aspects of development, you can try to convince yourself that you're saving time by just blowing past those and not investing in them. But the bill comes due, and just like on the road, if you're going 60 in a 20, somebody's going to pass you later while you're in the ditch. They're going 20 and they're going at the right speed, and they're playing it safe, and they're going to get to their destination probably before you do, really, and they're going to be just fine. So we try to live by that philosophy, which is, think ahead, have everything under control, well tested, well integrated, good processes, and that dictates what you're able to do at that point, as long as you've covered everything. And just however fast you move, that's how fast you move now, as long as you're not cutting corners.
Absolutely love it. And really such a great way to kind of come to close today, because again, it just does such a great job at summarizing just the importance of everything we discussed. Now, speaking of which, I know we talked a lot. There's a lot of, I hate to sound cheesy, guys, but there's tons of value bombs in here, guys. But that said, of all the information you shared, of what we talked, what are some, tips, suggestions, or advice you would give to our listeners today?
So I think I'll just settle on probably the biggest one, which is, so I gave a talk about this at GDC, and I got a lot of comments from people who were kind of overwhelmed, because when I gave the talk, we were only like a couple of years into our sort of DevOps journey, and by that time we did have a pretty healthy number of automated processes and some pretty nice, homebrew bespoke tools to solve the problems that we were having. And I got messages from people who were seeing these things I was talking about and feeling like, well, sure, you can do that because, you've got a bigger team and you spent years doing it. And, there's no way that I, as a one person, as a solo dev or as a small team, there's no way that I could spare the time to do these things, to take the time to update my processes in the ways that you described or whatever. But what I try to impress upon people is that when we were getting started down this journey of refining all of our processes, all of our initial solutions were really janky. As a quick example, deployments are a big challenge for game studios that are distributing games on a bunch of different platforms. So if you're putting your game on iOS, Android, Steam, Switch, Xbox, if you're casting a wide net, making those builds and compiling them takes a lot of compute time. And there was a time before our DevOps stuff where I was making those builds on my machine. And whenever I hit compile, then it's 20 minutes where my CPU is at 100% and I can't program. I can't do anything while that's happening. So we looked at that as one of our first bottlenecks. So like, how do we just suddenly add 20 hours a week of free time to Seth, the games programmer, while also being able to now produce more builds more frequently so that we can test changes in smaller batches. And we're like, well, let's automate our deployment pipeline. Well, there's lots of ways you can do that. And you could do that in a really sort of highbrow, lots of cloud computing and tons of bots and other stuff. Well, what we did at first is we had just like a basic script that we just had a separate laptop, like a cheap laptop that we got, set up this script on it, and we could just hit a button and like that would start the process and it would compile it, automatically deploy that. When I say deploy, I mean it would just like put the file into Dropbox, right? And then it would an email message would just go out to our QA team saying this new build is available. Here's the version number, and then they could open Dropbox and launch it from there, right? That's real janky. That's real duct tapey, right? Not a lot of real advanced tech going on in there. Nowadays, we use parallel cloud computing, and we don't need an extra laptop for it or anything like that. We don't use Dropbox. It actually distributes it directly to the platform, so it goes right to Steam, right to Google Play, whatever. And things become more sophisticated over time. But if you look at the sophisticated solutions and go, yeah, there's just no way. There's no way I can make deployments easier for myself. There are definitely ways, and it's not going to look that pretty at first, but you just need a starting point of something that you can start to iterate on to make your processes better. So that would be my sort of challenge, to your listeners is just take that first step, because once you do that, yeah, your solution is not going to be perfect, but you will already start to see some kind of gains from that. And then you can use those gains and the time saved from those gains to reinvest that into more process improvements, and things just get better and better, faster and faster. So don't be overwhelmed. Your solutions do not have to be perfect. They just have to be something. And then go from there and you'll be fine.
Awesome. Well, Seth, I can't thank you enough for that insight. And again, folks, you got to start somewhere. And you already know that with the whole process you're involved with game development as a whole, but when it comes to refining these things, with optimizing your processes, it's really no different than, hey, it's a different area aspect that you need to start with and iterate upon. It's no different than the game development process as a whole. So, and again, I can't thank you enough, Seth, because this is such insightful conversations and tips. I mean, there's just, if I keep trying to say and encapsulate all this, I'm just going to digress and ramble, and you guys hear enough of me as it is, because I'm here all the time. Seth isn't. So with that said, Seth, can't thank you enough, but what are ways people can find out more about Butterscotch shenanigans? I keep shortening it to just Butterscotch, but it's more than that. But drop us some links if people want to get in touch with you some way or connect, whatever. What are ways that people can do that too?
Yeah, easiest way, if you just go to bscotch.net, we've got a contact thing there where you can just send direct messages to the dev team through that. I don't really do much on social media, so I don't tweet or anything like that. So try to keep things pretty centralized in that way. Again, process improvement. Tweeting doesn't really add much value to anything. So maybe start there, cut that out. And otherwise, I do have some GDC talks if people are interested. Like I had mentioned, I think if you probably just look up my name plus GDC on YouTube, I've got a talk on DevOps that goes into a lot of depth about this kind of stuff. So.
Awesome. And folks, what we'll do too is in the show notes, we'll also include Seth's GDC talks, the links to where you can get those. Like you said, they're on YouTube, and obviously we'll provide the other information as well that he just shared. And again, don't forget to check out the podcast, Coffee with Butterscotch. As Seth already shared, it's a great time, great focus, great discussion. And again, this was a great discussion. Seth, I can't thank you enough for being here on the show with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.